Hyde Park on a crisp October afternoon was alive with the sounds of London at its most peaceful. Families strolled along the winding paths, children fed ducks by the Serpentine, and joggers weaved between tourists, taking photographs of the autumn foliage. It was the kind of day that reminded everyone why public parks were considered the great democratic spaces of the city, places where everyone, regardless of background or circumstance, could find a moment of tranquility. On a weathered wooden bench beneath a centuries-old oak tree, two men sat engaged in quiet conversation. The contrast between them was immediately apparent to anyone who might glance their way. One was a giant of a man, 6 feet 9 inches tall, wearing expensive casual clothes that couldn't quite disguise his fame. Tyson Fury, the former heavyweight champion of the world, instantly recognizable even when trying to blend into civilian life. Beside him sat a much older man, perhaps in his late 60s, whose appearance told a story of harder times. Albert Thornbury wore clothes that had clearly seen better days, a threadbare brown overcoat that was clean but patched in several places, shoes that had been resoled multiple times, and a woolen cap that had faded from what might once have been navy blue to an indeterminate grey. His white beard was neatly trimmed despite his circumstances, and his pale blue eyes held an intelligence and dignity that somehow persisted despite whatever hardships had brought him to this bench. The two men were discussing literature, specifically the poetry of William Blake, a conversation that had begun when Albert noticed Tyson reading a collection of English verse. It was an unlikely friendship, perhaps, but one that had developed over several months of chance encounters in this same spot. Albert had never asked Tyson for money, never treated him as anything other than another human being seeking quiet conversation, and Tyson had come to value these weekly chats as a respite from the demands of his public life. The thing about Blake, Albert was saying, his voice carrying the refined accent of someone well-educated, is that he understood suffering not as something to be endured, but as something to be transformed. Joy and woe are woven fine, he wrote. Most people forget the second half of that verse. Tyson nodded thoughtfully. What's the second half? A clothing for the soul divine. He believed that our pain, properly understood, becomes part of what makes us capable of genuine compassion. It was then that their peaceful afternoon was shattered by a voice dripping with contempt and disgust. Well, 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 look what we have here. Both men looked up to see Nigel Pembroke striding toward them with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any given space. At 48, Nigel was the picture of expensive London success, a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine, and a Rolex submariner that caught the afternoon light. His dark hair was professionally styled, his teeth were cosmetically perfect, and everything about his appearance screamed wealth and privilege. Beside him walked his wife, Constance Whitfield, a woman 10 years his junior, who had married into money and never let anyone forget it. She wore a designer coat that cost more than some people's cars, carried a handbag that represented months of ordinary wages, and looked at the world through eyes that had been trained to categorize people based solely on their economic value. "Nigel, what are you doing?" Constance asked as her husband stopped abruptly in front of the bench where Tyson and Albert sat. "I'm witnessing the decline of British society," Nigel announced, his voice loud enough to carry to the dozens of other park visitors within earshot. "Here we have Tyson Fury, supposedly a role model for young people, sitting on a park bench with a filthy vagrant like their old friends." The words hit the peaceful afternoon like a slap. Several families with children stopped their strolls to turn and stare. A group of teenagers who had been kicking a football paused their game. Even the joggers seemed to slow their pace as they passed, drawn by the unmistakable tension in Nigel's voice. Albert's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The dignity that had sustained him through their conversation seemed to shrivel under Nigel's contemptuous gaze. He lowered his head, his shoulders sagging as if trying to make himself invisible. The transformation was painful to watch, a proud man reduced to shame by nothing more than cruel words from a stranger. Tyson's reaction was very different. The former champion slowly turned his attention from Albert to Nigel, and something in his expression changed completely. The relaxed conversational demeanor vanished, replaced by the focused intensity that had once intimidated opponents across boxing rings around the world. "I'm sorry," Tyson said, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. "Did you just call my friend here filthy?" Nigel seemed to puff up with righteous indignation. "Your friend? Look at him. He's obviously homeless, probably hasn't had a proper wash in weeks, and here you are treating him like he's your equal. It's disgusting." "Nigel, please," Constance whispered, beginning to sense that this confrontation might not go the way her husband expected, but Nigel was just getting started. The small crowd that was gathering seemed to embolden him rather than discourage him. He had always been a man who enjoyed being the center of attention, and the opportunity to publicly criticize a celebrity for what he saw as inappropriate behavior was too tempting to resist. "Do you have any idea what kind of example you're setting?" he continued, gesturing dramatically toward the families with children who were now openly staring. "These kids look up to you, and here you are normalizing vagrancy, making it seem acceptable to live off society's charity instead of getting a proper job." Albert tried to stand, clearly intending to leave rather than subject his friend to further embarrassment. "Tyson, perhaps I should go—" "No," Tyson said firmly, placing a gentle but unmistakable restraining hand on Albert's shoulder. "You're not going anywhere. You have every right to sit on this bench, and you have nothing to be ashamed of." "Nothing to be ashamed of?" Nigel laughed harshly. "He's a burden on society, a waste of space who's chosen the easy path of begging instead of working for a living." The cruelty of the words seemed to hang in the air like poison. Several members of the growing crowd looked visibly uncomfortable with Nigel's venom, but no one seemed willing to directly challenge him. This was London, after all, where class distinctions still carried significant weight, and Nigel's expensive clothes gave him a presumed authority that most people were reluctant to question. But there was one member of the gathering crowd whose reaction was very different from the others. Timothy Blackwell, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s carrying a leather briefcase, had been walking through the park on his way back to his chambers when the commotion caught his attention. As he moved closer to get a better look at what was happening, his expression changed from curiosity to confusion to something approaching shock. He was staring directly at Albert with an intensity that suggested recognition, though he seemed to be having trouble believing what he was seeing. Margaret Ashworth, a local resident who knew both Tyson and Albert from their regular appearances in the park, finally found her voice. "Nigel Pembroke, you should be ashamed of yourself. This is completely unnecessary." Nigel turned his attention to her with the same contemptuous expression he had directed at Albert. "Oh, and I suppose you think it's perfectly normal for famous athletes to encourage this sort of behavior. What's next? Should we start inviting vagrants to formal dinners?" "What I think," Margaret replied with more courage than she felt, "is that you're being needlessly cruel to someone who's done nothing to deserve it." "Done nothing?" Nigel's voice rose to near shouting level. "He's chosen to live like a parasite. He's chosen to drain resources from hard-working people like myself who actually contribute to society." It was then that Timothy Blackwell stepped forward from the crowd, his face pale, but his voice steady. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the bench where Albert still sat with his head bowed in shame. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but— Albert, is that really you?" The question was asked with such genuine uncertainty and concern that even Nigel paused in his tirade. Albert looked up slowly, meeting Timothy's eyes for the first time, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition that carried years of shared history. "Hello, Timothy," Albert said quietly, his voice carrying a weariness that spoke of more than just this afternoon's humiliation. The simple exchange sent a ripple of confusion through the gathered crowd. Nigel looked back and forth between the two men, clearly trying to understand what was happening, but unwilling to let go of his self-righteous anger. "What's this about?" he demanded. "You know this vagrant?" Timothy turned to face Nigel with an expression that could have frozen water. "Vagrant? Did you just call this man a vagrant?" "That's exactly what I called him because that's exactly what he is," Nigel replied, though there was less certainty in his voice than there had been moments before. Timothy's response would change everything. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying the kind of formal authority that came from years of courtroom experience, "you are speaking about Sir Albert Thornbury, former Justice of the High Court, veteran of the Falklands War, and one of the most respected legal minds of his generation." The words fell into the gathering crowd like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread in all directions. Nigel's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his face cycling through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and slowly dawning horror as the implications of what he had just heard began to sink in. The transformation in the crowd was immediate and dramatic. The uncomfortable murmurs that had followed Nigel's cruel words were replaced by stunned silence as people tried to process this impossible revelation. Several members of the crowd began to look at Albert with new eyes, searching for signs of the distinguished man they were now told he had once been. Tyson, who had known Albert for months without ever learning his full story, felt his own understanding of his friend shift and expand. The intelligence, the refined speech, The deep knowledge of literature and law that had always impressed him during their conversations suddenly made perfect sense. But it was Nigel's reaction that captured everyone's attention. The confident, contemptuous businessman who had been so certain of his moral superiority just moments before now stood frozen in place, his face white with shock and his previous certainty crumbling like sand. That's impossible," he stammered, looking around the crowd as if seeking someone to tell him this was all an elaborate joke. "Look at him, he's homeless." The words hung in the air like an accusation against Nigel himself, revealing the poverty of his imagination, his inability to conceive that circumstances could reduce anyone, no matter how accomplished or respected, to the situation in which he had found Albert. And in that moment of stunned silence, with the autumn sun filtering through the ancient oak leaves above them, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple confrontation in a park. They were seeing the collision between assumption and reality, between prejudice and truth, between the comfortable certainties of class distinction and the humbling recognition of shared humanity. The silence that followed Timothy's revelation stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. In that brief eternity, the entire dynamics of the confrontation shifted like tectonic plates beneath the feet of everyone present. Nigel Pembroke, who moments before had been the self-appointed moral authority of the situation, now found himself in the deeply uncomfortable position of having publicly humiliated one of Britain's most distinguished former jurists. Timothy Blackwell, recognizing the magnitude of what had just transpired, stepped closer to Albert, with the expression of deep respect, mixed with profound sadness. As a junior barrister, he had appeared before Justice Thornbury's court many times, and he had always admired not just the man's legal acumen, but his fundamental decency and fairness. "Sir Albert," Timothy said formally, his voice carrying the reverence that his profession reserved for the most respected members of the judiciary, "I had no idea. I haven't seen you since your retirement. How have you been?" Albert slowly raised his head, and for the first time since Nigel's attack began, there was something approaching dignity in his posture. The recognition, the respect in Timothy's voice, seemed to remind him of who he had been before circumstances had reduced him to his current situation. "I've been better, Timothy," Albert replied with a sad smile. "Life has a way of teaching humility to those who thought they understood it." Nigel, still reeling from the shock of discovery, struggled to regain his footing in a conversation that had completely escaped his control. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just minutes before. "Even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't change the fact that he's chosen to live on the streets instead of taking responsibility for his life." The words were barely out of his mouth before Timothy whirled to face him, with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Chosen? You think he chose this?" "Well, obviously," Nigel began, but Timothy cut him off with the kind of legal precision that had made him one of London's most effective barristers. "Sir Albert lost everything, and I mean everything, caring for his dying wife during her 3-year battle with cancer. He mortgaged his house, sold his investments, spent his entire pension fund on experimental treatments that the NHS couldn't provide. When she died, he was left with nothing but debt and grief so profound that he couldn't function. He lost his home, his health, his ability to work, and very nearly his will to live." Each word hit Nigel like a physical blow, but Timothy wasn't finished. This man presided over some of the most important legal decisions of the last 2 decades. He helped establish precedents for workers' rights, environmental protection, and social justice that have improved the lives of millions of people. And when his wife was dying, he gave up everything, including his own future, to try to save her. The crowd that had gathered was now listening in rapt attention, the casual curiosity that had first drawn them replaced by genuine engagement with a human drama that was unfolding before their eyes. Several people were openly emotional, moved by the tragedy of Albert's story and the cruelty he had just endured. Margaret Ashworth, who had tried earlier to defend Albert without knowing his history, now felt tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Albert," she whispered, "why didn't you ever tell us?" Albert turned to her with a gentle expression that somehow maintained its kindness, despite everything he had endured. "What would have been the point, my dear? The past doesn't change the present. I am what I am now, regardless of what I once was." But Nigel wasn't ready to accept defeat, even in the face of such overwhelming evidence of his error. Pride and embarrassment were driving him to double down on his position rather than admit the magnitude of his mistake. All right," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "So he used to be important, but that was then. Look at him now. Whatever his past achievements, he's currently a burden on society. He's still taking resources from hard-working taxpayers instead of finding a way to support himself. The callousness of the response drew audible gasps from several members of the crowd. Even Constance, who had remained largely silent throughout the confrontation, looked at her husband with something approaching horror. "Nigel, stop," she whispered urgently, tugging at his sleeve. "You're making this worse." But Nigel shook her off, his embarrassment now driving him toward even more extreme positions. "No, I won't stop. Someone needs to say what everyone else is thinking. Just because he used to be somebody doesn't mean we should coddle him now." It was then that another voice joined the conversation, one that carried even more authority than Timothy's legal credentials. Inspector Davies of the Metropolitan Police, who had been patrolling the park in plainclothes, had been drawn by the commotion and recognized several familiar faces. "Sir Albert," Inspector Davies said as he approached the group, his voice carrying genuine surprise and pleasure. "My God, sir, it really is you." Albert's face brightened for the first time since the confrontation began. "Inspector Davies, how wonderful to see you again." "It's Chief Inspector now, sir, thanks partly to that recommendation you wrote for me 15 years ago." Davies turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that this man personally intervened to save my career when I was facing false corruption charges. He reviewed my case pro bono, identified the real culprits, and ensured that justice was served." The inspector's testimony seemed to break something loose in the gathering crowd. One by one, people began to step forward with their own memories and stories of Albert's impact on their lives. An elderly woman named Rebecca Fairfax, who had been walking her dog when the commotion began, recognized Albert from a case 20 years in the past. "Sir Albert," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "you saved my family's home when a predatory lender tried to foreclose illegally. My grandchildren grew up in that house because of your ruling." A middle-aged man in painter's overalls stepped forward next. "You presided over my divorce case, sir. When my ex-wife's lawyer tried to deny me access to my children based on my working-class background, you shut that down immediately. Said justice was blind to bank accounts and job titles." Story after story emerged from the crowd, lives saved, injustices corrected, precedents established that had protected the vulnerable and held the powerful accountable. With each testimony, Albert seemed to grow straighter, his dignity gradually returning as he was reminded of the man he had been and the difference he had made. And with each story, Nigel seemed to shrink, the magnitude of his error becoming more apparent with every passing moment. Tyson, who had remained largely silent throughout these revelations, finally spoke up. "You know what's really interesting about this whole situation?" he said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that commanded everyone's attention. "What's that?" Timothy asked. "Mr. Pembroke here has spent the last 20 minutes telling us all about the importance of judging people by their contributions to society, their work ethic, their value to the community." Tyson's eyes never left Nigel's face as he spoke. "Well, here's a man who spent decades serving justice, protecting the vulnerable and making society fairer for everyone, and the first thing our moral authority here did was insult him, degrade him, and try to shame him in public." The observation hit its target with devastating precision. Nigel's face went through several color changes as he realized how perfectly Tyson had summarized the contradiction at the heart of his behavior. I didn't know," Nigel stammered, but the words sounded hollow even to himself. "No," Tyson agreed. "You didn't know. You didn't bother to know. You saw someone you thought was beneath you, and you decided that gave you the right to treat him like garbage." Constance, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with her husband's behavior, finally found her voice. "Nigel, we need to leave, now." But Nigel wasn't ready to retreat, even though every word out of his mouth was only making his situation worse. "Fine, so I was wrong about his background, but my point still stands. Why should successful people like myself have to support people who aren't contributing?" The question revealed so much about Nigel's fundamental worldview that several people in the crowd actually stepped backward, as if physical distance could protect them from the toxic selfishness on display. It was Albert himself who provided the response that would define the remainder of the confrontation. Albert Thornbury slowly rose from the park bench, his movement deliberate and dignified despite the threadbare condition of his clothing. As he stood to his full height, something remarkable happened. The bearing that had once commanded respect in Britain's highest courtrooms seemed to reassert itself, transforming him from a target of scorn into a figure of unmistakable authority. The crowd fell silent as Albert turned to face Nigel Pembroke directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades weighing words carefully, understanding that language could heal or harm, build up or tear down. "Mr. Pembroke," Albert began, his tone neither angry nor defensive, but carrying a quiet dignity that made everyone lean forward to listen. "You ask why successful people should support those who aren't contributing. It's a fair question, and one that deserves a thoughtful answer." Nigel shifted uncomfortably, perhaps beginning to realize that he was about to receive a lesson from someone far more qualified to discuss the complexities of social responsibility than he had initially understood. "During my 30 years on the bench," Albert continued, "I presided over thousands of cases involving people from every walk of life, wealthy businessmen who had defrauded their investors, working mothers fighting for fair wages, children seeking protection from abusive families, elderly people defending their life savings from predatory schemes." He paused, his pale blue eyes meeting Nigel's with the kind of direct gaze that had once compelled truthfulness from countless witnesses. "And what I learned, Mr. Pembroke, is that the line between success and failure, between contribution and dependence, between dignity and desperation, is far thinner than most comfortable people like to believe." Timothy Blackwell nodded in recognition of the wisdom he had heard Albert express many times from the bench. Several members of the crowd murmured their agreement, having witnessed enough of life's unpredictability to understand the truth in Albert's words. "For you see me now as someone who doesn't contribute," Albert continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "But 6 years ago, I was making decisions that affected millions of lives. I was contributing not just through taxes on a substantial salary, but through service to the principle that justice should be available to everyone, regardless of their economic status." Albert began walking slowly around the space in front of the bench, not pacing nervously, but moving with the measured rhythm of someone making a legal argument. "My wife, Eleanor, was diagnosed with an aggressive form of brain cancer that required experimental treatments not available through the NHS. I had a choice: accept the limitations of standard care and watch her die, or spend everything we had accumulated over a lifetime of public service to give her a chance at survival." The pain in his voice was evident, but so was the certainty of someone who had made his choice without regret. "I chose love over security, hope over prudence. I mortgaged our home, liquidated our investments, borrowed against my pension. For 3 years, I fought alongside her, spending not just our money but our emotional and physical reserves in a battle we ultimately lost." Constance Whitfield found herself crying openly, her hand pressed to her mouth as she tried to contain her emotion. Even some of the men in the crowd were wiping their eyes, moved by the raw honesty of Albert's account. "When Eleanor died," Albert continued, "I discovered that grief is not just an emotional condition, it's a physical and mental disability that can be as devastating as any disease. I couldn't focus, couldn't work, couldn't even manage the basic tasks of daily life. The debts I had accumulated in fighting for her life came due, and I lost our home, my ability to practice law, and eventually, my health." He stopped walking and faced Nigel directly again, his expression neither hostile nor pleading, but simply honest. "So yes, Mr. Pembroke, you're correct that I'm not currently contributing to society in the way you understand contribution. But I would ask you to consider whether my 30 years of public service, my sacrifice for my wife, and my current struggle to rebuild my life from nothing might represent a different kind of value than the purely economic contribution you seem to prize." The silence that followed Albert's words was profound. Even the normal sounds of the park, children playing, dogs barking, traffic in the distance, seemed muted by the weight of what they had just heard. Inspector Davies stepped forward, his professional composure clearly affected by Albert's story. "Sir Albert, I had no idea about Eleanor. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Chief Inspector. Eleanor always said that loss shared is loss diminished, though I'm still learning to believe that." It was then that Rebecca Fairfax, the elderly woman whose home Albert had once saved, made a decision that would become the defining moment of the entire confrontation. "Sir Albert," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I want you to know that the house you saved for my family, we still live there. My daughter and her children live there now. 3 generations have been raised in that home because of your sense of justice." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small notebook, quickly writing something on a page before tearing it out and approaching Albert. "This is my address and phone number," she said, pressing the paper into his hand. "Rebecca Fairfax, I want you to come to dinner this Sunday. I want my family to meet the man who gave us our home." The gesture seemed to break something loose in the gathered crowd. The middle-aged painter who had spoken earlier stepped forward next. "Sir Albert, I'm a master electrician now. Have my own business. The access to my children that you protected allowed me to raise 2 sons who are both in university. If you ever need work, even just part-time, I'd be honored to have you." One by one, members of the crowd began offering Albert not charity, but opportunity, recognition, and most importantly, the restoration of his place in a community that had almost lost track of his value. Timothy Blackwell, moved by what he was witnessing, made his own offer. "Sir Albert, I know you can't practice law anymore due to your circumstances, but my chambers could use someone with your experience to review case law and mentor young barristers. The pay wouldn't be substantial, but it would be honest work, and it would allow the legal community to benefit from your wisdom again." Through all of this, Nigel Pembroke stood frozen, watching his entire worldview crumble around him. The man he had dismissed as worthless was being revealed as someone who had touched more lives, made more meaningful contributions, and demonstrated more genuine courage than Nigel could ever hope to achieve. But it was Albert's response to this outpouring of support that provided the most powerful lesson of the entire afternoon. Albert looked around at all the faces, people he had helped years ago, people who were meeting him for the first time, people who had witnessed his humiliation and were now offering him restoration. And when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, but clear in its message. "Your kindness is overwhelming," he said, "and more healing than you can know. But I want to say something to Mr. Pembroke before we finish here today." Albert turned to face Nigel, who was now visibly trembling, whether from embarrassment, fear, or some other emotion. "Mr. Pembroke, you were not wrong to see someone in need when you looked at me. You were not wrong to notice that I am, in fact, dependent on the kindness of others for my survival. What you were wrong about was assuming that my current circumstances told you everything you needed to know about my worth as a human being." Albert extended his hand toward Nigel, a gesture so unexpected that several people gasped audibly. "I don't blame you for making that assumption," Albert continued, his hand still extended. "Life had not yet taught you that any of us can fall, that success and failure are often separated by nothing more than circumstances beyond our control, that the measure of a person's worth cannot be taken from a single moment in their story." Nigel stared at the offered hand for what felt like an eternity. Around him, the crowd waited in absolute silence to see how he would respond to this extraordinary offer of forgiveness. Slowly, hesitantly, Nigel reached out and took Albert's hand. The handshake was brief, but in that moment something fundamental shifted in Nigel's understanding of the world and his place in it. "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what I said today," Nigel said, his voice barely audible. "I owe you an apology for every assumption I've ever made about people whose stories I didn't bother to learn." Albert smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something approaching the distinguished judge he had once been. "Apology accepted, Mr. Pembroke. But more importantly, I hope today has taught both of us something valuable about the danger of judging others by their circumstances rather than their character." As the crowd began to disperse, individuals continued to approach Albert with offers of help, friendship, and respect. Tyson, who had watched the entire transformation with growing amazement, finally stood to take his leave. "Albert," he said, "I thought I was just sitting with a friend who liked to discuss poetry. I had no idea I was learning from one of the most remarkable men in Britain." Albert chuckled, the sound carrying more genuine warmth than had been heard from him in years. "Tyson, my boy, everyone has a story worth knowing. The trick is taking the time to listen to it before deciding what it means." As they parted ways that afternoon, each person carried with them a profound reminder that dignity, worth, and contribution to society could not be measured by external appearances or current circumstances. They had witnessed not just the humiliation of prejudice, but its transformation into understanding, forgiveness, and renewed hope. Nigel Pembroke walked home that evening, carrying the weight of a lesson that would change how he saw every stranger he encountered for the rest of his life. That behind every face was a story he didn't know, and behind every story was a human being deserving of respect, regardless of their current chapter. The homeless man on the park bench had taught them all that true class wasn't about what you wore or what you owned. It was about how you treated others when you had the power to either lift them up or tear them down.